speaker, Dr. Curtis Busby Earl, Senior Lecturer in the Department of Computing. Mr. Chris Record. I will read out the bios later. Mrs. M. Georgia Gibson-Henlin and Ms. Michael Jackson from the Jamaicans for Justice. Our very first speaker. So, of course, NIDS is a topic that many of us are concerned about. We've heard a lot about it. It is currently underway in some sort of pilot stage of implementation. We'll certainly hear more about it throughout the course of the afternoon. We are looking forward to a very informative session. Each speaker will have 15 minutes to make their presentations. We will then move into a discussion phase where various questions and answers will be taken from the audience, as well as I will pose to each panelist to respond, perhaps from points made by other speakers. So our very first speaker is Dr. Curtis Busby Earl. He's a senior lecturer in the Department of Computing at a colleague of mine here at UWI-Mona. And his research interests are in software security, software engineering, and most recently, quantum computing. He's also a certified ethical hacker and the Associate Dean for Graduate Studies and Research in the faculty. So without further ado, we'll welcome Dr. Busby Earl to present on security technology, hopefully behind NIDS. Dr. Busby Earl.
Thank you very much, Prof. Kaur, and good afternoon, colleagues. Good afternoon to everyone that has joined us here this afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. And I'll be talking a little bit about data protection, and in particular, the things that have been mentioned that I've seen in the Act for the Jamaica's NIDS. And those in particular are related to biometrics and cryptography. So just a bit quickly about myself. As Professor Kaur mentioned, I am in the Department of Computing at the Mona campus of the University of the West Indies over the years, and I've been here at the university for over 15 years. God, that sounds like a long time. And so they include cybersecurity or software security, in particular, software engineering with a focus on requirements engineering, and most recently, quantum computing. And it's actually because of one of the topics that I'm talking about today, that's cryptography, that really sparked my interest in quantum computing. If there are any questions or if there's anything that you'd like to shoot, send me an email. And my email address is here at the bottom of the slide. So we have 15 minutes today, and I'd be chatting a little bit about cybersecurity concerns and challenges in Jamaica, as I've seen in the media and as I've heard through various discussions. And it's really just a very few of them. It's hopefully going to give an idea of some of the concerns that are being expressed about the implementation of NIDS. And then, well, how will my data be protected according to what is stated in the Act? And again, this is going to be based on my knowledge of what those mechanisms are, not how they are specifically going to be implemented. I have no idea. I would leave that to Mr. Record. Hopefully, he can talk a bit about those specifics. And I'll then get into a bit more on biometrics. Look at some examples, the pros and cons of biometric data. Just some thoughts on what happens if that data or that data is stolen, your data is stolen or compromised, and about cryptography and how cryptography is used to actually protect the data that you would be providing. So in the past 5 years, there has been a really sharp increase in, and I use this word specifically, the reported cases of cybercrimes. It's not that yes, they have increased generally, but the incidence of the reports have also increased. And some of the examples and some of the reasons include, the individuals, public and private sector organizations have all been victims. You've seen reports on government institutions, government facilities that have been compromised. not just in Jamaica, but you would have seen, for example, in Trinidad and Tobago and other islands in the Caribbean. There was a few years back, the Jam COVID web portal that spurred a lot of discussion. And there was that breach and subsequent leak back in 2021. Social engineering attacks are very prevalent from different ways in which websites are used to grab data on individuals, which can then be used to access their personal data, to other forms that use things like WhatsApp and other social media platforms. There's the, of course, growing online presence that we have experienced from the services that our government has provided on the internet to those services that have existed for quite some time that we have access to that are international. For example, many of us use Facebook, many of us use Amazon, and many other services. But this is all despite the lack of secure internet servers. And there are reports and there's data that support the fact that Jamaica in particular has a number of servers that have direct access to the internet that are not properly or adequately secured. And of course, this has both been some very positive news and very positive direction in which we're going, and that's our increased economic success. But unfortunately, that also makes us in Jamaica a more interesting target. And so these are some of the reasons why we have to look at things like cryptography and biometrics and how are we to protect our data and how do we improve our cybersecurity presence, and all of this while still continuing to provide the services that we wish to make access easier, to make it more widespread and universal. Some of the concerns and challenges, or other concerns and challenges that I've seen expressed include, for example, will the system encrypt and anonymize data? Yes, it will, but there's no specificity as to whether the system architecture and databases will be decentralized. There's no actual specifics on the encryption mechanism or how the data will be anonymized, at least not what that I have seen again. In addition, the legislators had not taken up some recommendations that included the separation of identity and information from authentication requests. And there are some consequences for some of these things, right? There, as we'll see, has been mentioned about how things will be tracked, audit trails. There has also been some mention in media reports about how some of the data will be protected. Again, for example, your fingerprint and facial image will be encrypted. So, all right, I know that there is the case where fingerprints and facial images will be captured. And yes, they'll be encrypted, but what's the, again, encryption mechanism? And therefore, at least I see that there'll be two types of biometrics, or two examples of biometrics. That's the fingerprint and facial images that will be captured. It's also been stated, again, both of these by Mr. Vernon, who is the program director for the National Identification System, and this was back in 2021, that they're implementing for the first time a national public key infrastructure. So that also tells me that it's a particular type of encryption called a public key system, and that will be the security backbone for the solution. But as we'll see, there are different types of different implementations of public key systems that could be used and that are used in other countries, but I don't know which one we will be adopting. And by the Honorable Minister without portfolio in the OPM back during the sectoral debate of 2022-2023, he stated that they're ensuring that the audit trails of the system will be protected using blockchain technology. And so that again is the third way that I've seen. The other two being biometrics and encryption, right? The third being blockchain that we will be using as forms or mechanisms to ensure the safety and security of the data that is captured and that is kept on NIDS. But what are these things, the biometrics, the cryptography, and so on? Well, biometrics in particular, I spent a little time, is just data. It's data based on an individual, and it's based upon their unique physical characteristics. And those physical characteristics can either be static or dynamic. So for example, a static physical characteristic is your fingerprint. That doesn't really change. Your retina, your iris, and your facial features. dynamic physical characteristic. For example, as I'm speaking to you, my voice raises and lowers, it changes, my intonation changes as I speak. My signature, although some may expect that it is the same every time I make it, there are actually little differences. And so how I write from time to time, or each time I make my signature, there will be little differences. Although there are some aspects of it that will remain consistent. How I form certain letters, how I join certain letters, my style of writing, right? But unlike other data that's used for authentication, like passwords, which should be combinations, for example, of letters of the alphabet, digits, and other special characters, nonces, which are, again, groups of characters or numbers that are used once and once only for a particular transaction. A biometric is, in essence, a pattern. So we take up the pattern of your fingerprint by looking at certain points of your retina or of the recording of your voice and create a digital representation, of that. And that's that pattern. And so using biometrics is a little more complex and can be a little more expensive depending on the particular biometric that is being used. And here you see, for example, there is a trade-off between the cost of the biometric and its accuracy. So the most expensive, but also the most accurate at this point, is the use of one's iris. The voice is probably the least expensive, but also is the least accurate, or one of the least accurate. But that does not mean that they can't be compromised, right? Biometrics, therefore, are physical characteristics that are mapped into digital representations, which is that pattern. And it's a single digital representation that's stored on any particular system. And therefore, the authentication and identification of an individual involves a comparison. So let's say you wish to engage with a government institution and you are asked to present a biometric. And so they ask for your fingerprint, for example. And so what happens is your fingerprint, when you would have registered with the system, would have been stored. When you present your fingerprint, so you put your fingerprint on the reader, it captures, again, that pattern, and it compares that pattern with the one that's stored. And so that's the pattern matching. Now, it isn't expected that it will be 100% the same every time. You may have a bit of oil or a bit of dust or something on your finger at that point in time when you present it, and that might change the pattern. However, these pattern matching algorithms take things, let's say, with a grain of salt. So it's something within a range that will therefore be expected to be considered as a match or not. And as I said, it can still be compromised. So I used an example of an iris, which, as we saw, was the most accurate. But a few years ago, we saw that actually in the United Arab Emirates, they had implemented a border control system, and it also included iris scans. But, people can be crafty and we are ingenious. And so some people circumvented those scans by using eye drops. And those eye drops dilated the person's eyes and therefore pushed the pattern recognition and that matching to a point where instead of being rejected, it was accepted. So what are some of the advantages or the pros of biometrics? Well, generally, they're extremely difficult to replicate. Your iris, your facial features, they're difficult to replicate. They're also more reliable, in comparison with things like a password, right? And they're more reliable in particular in their association with an individual and the individual that particular biometric represents. They're more accurate in the representation of a person's identity or of an identity. And of course, there's a familiarity with use. So you don't have to really be trained to present your finger or to look into a camera or to speak into a microphone. That comes naturally. And these things have been around for quite some time now. Many years ago, Apple, for example, incorporated fingerprints and facial recognitions. Many laptops have fingerprint readers. They are widespread. We use them very routinely. Some of the cons: it's generally considered invasive. Even fairly recently, there are applications, there are online applications. Let's take, for example, Airbnb, if anyone has ever used it. They now require that some image be captured of you. There's a bit of hesitation in presenting your image to certainly an application that has worldwide access. And so these things generally are typically considered to be somewhat invasive. And therefore, many are unwilling to provide biometric data because your face, your fingerprint, your iris, your retina, these are all now being stored in a public database. And that idea of public kind of stirs this set of concerns that people may have. A physical injury could alter a biometric. Some can be easily captured, and they could be captured without an individual's consent or knowledge. Your face could be captured by a camera. You could be walking in public. You could be walking in a store, and your image could be captured. Your voice could be captured. Someone could be outside sitting on a bench while you're walking past and take a picture of you. And then there's also the cost of the acquisition of such systems and their implementation. And as we saw, if it's something along the lines of using on one's iris, that's the most expensive. And of course, we haven't spoken about the maintenance costs. Now, what if an individual's password is captured or guessed? Well, again, you could change it, right? Change it from 1, 2, 3, 4 to 5, 6, 7, 8. Don't use that as an example. That's an extremely poor password, right? But you get my meaning. Or you can improve the password's strength. What if you use a smartphone that's tied to an account and that smartphone is lost or it's stolen? Many of us, if we use online banking, for example, many of them use transaction authentication numbers where a number is sent to your smartphone. And so your smartphone is tied to an account. If you lose it, replace it with another or update the service provider's records. But if an individual's biometric is captured or stolen, you can't really talk about changing a person's face or a person's fingerprint or improve it or replacing it in that meaning. It's not as straightforward as a password, right? And so some of the consequences of the loss of data, and I take, for example, Ashley Madison as an example, because that really was, that blew up. That really caused a stir. And that was back in 2015 when lots of people had their information that they thought and they were told was private and secure was made public for the world to see. Biometric data can be acquired, as I said, without consent, and therefore templates can be created without prior knowledge, and that therefore could raise the concern of identity theft. And impersonation also therefore becomes much more credible. When used for authentication, loss of all other data secured with biometrics could be a result. And so protecting one's biometric data becomes crucial. And so how do we do that? Well, biometrics are still data. There are robust and reliable procedures and methods that already exist. And I'm suggesting that multi-layered security that must include cryptography and hashes should be a part and parcel of it. And we've seen that these have been mentioned in the Act. And by multi-layered, I mean we should have multi-factor authentication. And I made reference to an example earlier where we use, for example, a username and a TAN or transaction authentication number. Or we can have biometrics, multiple biometrics, a fingerprint plus a facial image plus voice recognition. And so you can therefore incorporate static and dynamic protocols, but things would be dependent upon the type of biometric being used and the system that we're implementing. We also use cryptography, and cryptography and the different mechanisms will provide confidentiality and integrity and digital signatures. There are a number of algorithms that are publicly available and applications that utilize them. Now, the fact that they're publicly available and they have been for decades does not diminish the effectiveness of the security mechanism and system. I'm talking about things like RSA and elliptic curve cryptography and AES, advanced encryption standards, right? These are security protocols and mechanisms that have been around for quite some time. They have been tried and tested, and they are reliable and they are secure. So what are they? Well, the AES is what we call a symmetric key encryption approach, where we use one key that both encrypts or scrambles data and decrypts that same data. And two people, let's say Professor Ko and I, that want to exchange information, we each have one key, but it's the same key. So think of a padlock that when you buy it, they normally or typically come with two keys. The two keys are exact copies of each other. We use that same key to unlock and to get access to what that lock is protecting. These have been used in digital societies. An example is in India, the Aadhaar system. And that system, by the way, ladies and gentlemen, has been in use for over 15 years. And as stated by the Unique Identification Authority of India, which is a branch of the government of India, the Aadhaar database has never, and that's in the public database, the CIDR, has never been breached in all those 15 years of its existence. These things are secure. There's a Diffie-Hellman key exchange protocol that is used exclusively to exchange a symmetric key along the lines of an AES key. But there's also the RSA, which is named after its creators, which has been widely used for digital signatures and data encryption. And in this case, think of another lock. But this lock has a master key and a number of other keys that could be shared. And so if I wanted to communicate with not just Professor Ko, but Mrs. Gibson-Henlin and Mr. Record, I can each give them a key and they could open those locks. But I have the master key that can open any of the locks, right? So I can communicate with each of them individually and they would know that they are communicating with me because I'm the only other person that can open a lock with that master key. The thing with RSA is that as computer power increases and the size of the keys must also increase to increase security, there is overhead that's involved. And that overhead has posed a challenge. And to overcome that challenge, there have been implementations that use smaller keys. And those smaller keys then pose a security risk. So for example, there's the coppersmith attack, where a private key of a private and public key pair can actually be determined by just having access to the associated public key. So it is secure, but like so many other things, it's based on its implementation. Elliptic curve has been touted as the replacement or the successor to RSA. And what it does is provides a similar level of security as RSA. It's also a public key system, but it uses smaller key sizes, right? And of course, we use hashes. And a hash is taking any size or amount of data and creating what we call a block of data that's of a fixed size. And the thing is, once any bit of data is changed in the source or the input, the hash will also be changed. And we can therefore use hashes to verify the integrity or to make sure the data has not been altered. And these things are all incorporated, for example, in blockchain technology, where we have what is called, in essence, a linked list, and the data that we wish to secure is stored within each of the nodes of that list, and that data is hashed, and access to that data or to that linked list or that blockchain is also incorporated by using public keys and symmetric keys to perform the hashes, right?
Sorry to interrupt, Dr. Busby, but
I'm finishing.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
And so in conclusion, biometrics can provide significant advantages towards becoming a digital society, in my opinion. I'm really looking forward to seeing how these are going to be implemented in NIDS. It's towards personal identification, authentication for delivery of services. There are ways and means of securing this data through cryptography that are tried and tested, widely used, and have been proven to provide various levels of strong protection. Thank you very much. That's it from me. Back over to you, Prof. Ko.
Thank you very much, Dr. Busby. Very informative for especially those who may not be aware of what kinds of technologies are available for for securing information and what kinds of technologies have been contemplated for use within NIDS. We will now hear a little bit from Mr. Chris Record about what's actually in NIDS. And during the discussion, I'm sure there will be some very important points that you have raised, Dr. Busby Earl, that whether or not they're covered in the presentations, we will have a chance to explore. So with that, let me introduce Mr. Chris Record, who serves on several boards and committees for businesses and the government of Jamaica, including the recently formed National Artificial Intelligence Task Force, where he serves as the chairman, and the Data Protection Oversight Committee, where he currently serves as also the chairman. Chris was also just appointed as a member of the National Identification and Registration Authority Board to make NIDS a reality. So he's certainly, hopefully, one of the right people in the right place to tell us what is in store, how NIDS is going to be implemented and where it's at this stage. Chris, welcome. Looking forward to hearing your talk.
Thanks, Prof. Good afternoon, everyone. And I hope, so what I've done, Prof, is to take my 40-slide presentation and squashed it down to 10 slides that hopefully we deliver the information that's required. So as you may notice, what I have on the screen says NERA. It doesn't say NIDS. And there's a reason for that, because the name NIDS or the acronym NIDS was for the National Identification System, and the organization NERA is the government organization that will implement that system. So this is where we are right now, and I will give you a very high-level overview as to what that's all about. I will speak to a little bit about the security, and then I will leave it up to questions after that to get into the detail. So the organization called NERA was recently established. It's a new body established under a law, an act, the National Identification and Registration Act 2021. And this organization now has responsibility for the country's national identification and civil registration services. So NERA is empowered by law to issue citizens and ordinary residents with a NIC, a National Identification Card. So that's going to be what people get in their hand, right? And that is something that will be produced by the system. Civil registration services currently are carried out under the RGD, which will become managed by NERA as the organization grows, because I said the organization is brand spanking new. The regulations were actually just passed in the upper house and the lower house within the last month. That's how new it is, right? Apart from having a board, the organization will also have what they call an inspectorate. So there is an independent oversight body which will have responsibility to monitor the compliance of the act and regulations, monitor the performance of the authority, conduct periodic audits, make recommendations to the authority to improve operations, and of course, investigate issues and complaints regarding the authority. So there is that oversight body. So where does NIDS and NERA come together? NIDS is the system itself, the complete end-to-end system, right? NIDS was being worked on for the last, I don't know, I'll say maybe 4 or 5 years, but the discussion of something that appears to be like NIDS and national identification has been happening for approximately 50 years, believe it or not. Between 40 and 50 years, there has been successful administrations making the call, and various industries making the call for some sort of a national identification system. One of our challenges is that a tremendous amount of activities that happen between the citizens and government just simply takes too long. To do any sort of transaction with government, sometimes, as I'm a justice of the peace, and let me tell you something, there are some things that I have received to sign to prove where people live, to prove what they do, to give some sort of a verification. The back and forth with something like that is tremendous. And what this system, what the solution will do is reduce all of that, and in some instances, make a lot of that go away. So, speaker before, Dr. Busby Earl, spoke about the some components of what will make up this identification system. So the system will in fact use biometrics. And as he suggested and it's almost like a best practice kind of that he suggested, we're not going for the most expensive, we're not going for the cheapest, we're going for, based upon our population size, based upon research that was done globally, we're going for the balance of face, fingerprints, and manual signature, right? So if you notice in his graph, face was in the middle, my memory serves me correctly. Fingerprints were on the less risk, lower cost side, but face was middle towards, you know, best practice. We didn't go for iris, too expensive, and not really necessary for our population size, which is relatively small, right? So this is what will happen in our system. So with respect to what I can officially speak about for our security, just respecting the various folks that are listening and all the various media that are out there, there's no organization in the world that will sit down and explain to you what their security is. It's not going to happen, right? But at a very high level, we can talk about some of the security considerations, which I'll do in the next couple of slides. But disclosure of the identity information can only happen under our law in 3 ways. By consent of you, the data subject, the individual, saying it's okay. So you go to the bank, you go to an institution, an organization, and you hand in an application for a service or a product. They will then say, oh, we need the following, right? You can go through the long drawn out way of finding a JP and bringing in 4 IDs and all of these things, or you can get your services delivered instantaneously or as close to that as possible by providing your NIC. Now, in providing your NIC, the system will be set up so that you will get an instant notification. Hey, the bank that you're at wants your consent. Yes, no, that's it. You will give that organization permission to get the information. The only other 2 ways that your consent or access to your identification is either through a judge or as required as any other specific act or law that is currently already in existence in Jamaica. So this is how information will be disclosed by a third party, whether it's a bank or courts or, you know, wherever a person may go to for some services. Now, what is protecting that information? What's making sure that nobody else is seeing that information is the security that we talk about. I will very high level speak of some of the security, but as I said, I gave a warning preface that I can't go into excruciating details about security because no organization does that. And we as a organization designed for identification and to protect your identity can't sit down and explain to people exactly what security services are using. Understand though, we have a term that we use sometime in this IT industry, and I've been in the IT industry for almost 40 years. We'll talk about best practice. The NERA team, previously the NIDS project team, and their then technical and security working group, trust me, they went to the world to view what were the best practices around doing something like this. And I've implemented a tremendous amount of those best practices for what we're doing right now. So the NERA encrypts all identity information, including fingerprints and facial images of enrolled persons. The government has invested in a national PKI system to support this infrastructure. And of course, the newly implemented e-passport will also be benefiting from some of the infrastructure that's there because it's all tied to identification. So based upon what was discussed previously, Dr. Busby Earl spoke about some of the risk related to collecting some of these biometrics. The fingerprints collected will not be shared with any third party at all. Patterns of the enrolled fingerprint, not the full print, will be stored on the card that they will get, all right, for authentication. And the card holder's PIN is required for access to information on the card, and then for any sort of comparison and authentication that's required under the permission of the card holder, right? So it is multi-factor authentication all the way, right? identity information is logged and the owner's identity is notified for transparency, as I mentioned. What will happen is that that individual, the data subject, will have to give permission if an organization or person or whoever that has the required information, you have to give that person that right. Right? Access to personal information is restricted by authorized officers who provide services to their own persons. So, for example, the bank, whatever institution that you're going to keep using courts as an example, organizations like courts, you're going to go buy products or services, and you're going to, credit union, an organization, financial institution, insurance companies, anybody that you need to verify your information with, you have to give that organization permission to get that information from you, right? So they can't just willy-nilly go and get it. Access to the personal information is logged, and logs are protected by blockchain. So the term blockchain came up before, and this is how blockchain is used in our system. For those who know and understand what blockchain is, it is providing the protection for the logs. For those who don't understand much of what blockchain is, it's a logging system that is practically unbeatable. In other words, if I have written my name that I went and accessed this information at 10 o'clock on Thursday morning, on this date, that information, once logged, can never be removed from how the blockchain system is set up to operate. So at any point in time, if somebody said that this person accessed the system illegally and got my information illegally, the team can quickly look at the log, the immutable log that cannot be changed, to look to say, when did they say that happen? What date, when? No, we're not seeing anything like that here. That's untrue, that didn't happen. Or in reverse, look, somebody said that they went and got the information, that they couldn't get any information, they tell me that I'm not approved, blah, blah. And through the necessary channels, one can say, our logs say that the bank did in fact get permission from you, they did in fact access the system, and they got what they needed, right? So it works both ways. So that's one of the main reasons why the blockchain is being used for there. Strong physical and logical security to manage and reduce risk. Very, 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 very important. Now, on your side, if you are providing false information, then it's a problem, right? You submit false information, or you wore a mask to take the picture. I mean, I'm just going on an extreme right here, but you can be fined up to $1 million or imprisonment, or both. Breach of duty of security and confidentiality, you can also be fined up to $3 million in a parish court, or if it gets up to circuit court level, $10 million in imprisonment. Apology. So how does the card that you're going to get look? As I said, I've simplified my slides. I've taken out a lot of stuff just to keep to the important parts here. On the front, there are a number of security features on the front of the card, and also some on the back of the card. Serial, documented serial number, laser engraved. There's various patterns of printing. For those who have gone into an institution and they have taken cash from you and put it on the UV lamp, you will see that there are security features there that those persons are trained to look for. It's the exact same thing with the cards. So there are security features on the front of the card, there are security features on the back of the card, and you'll also notice what information is on the card. It is the national identification number, the NIN, your name, your nationality, and your date of birth. That's what's on the front of the card. And of course, hidden features. And on the back of the card, it's your address, and there is a future discussion around driver's license. It may all be incorporated into one card. So facility for that is there. And of course, any investment of this type at this age and stage in our digital maturity as a country, we have to make sure that we have the ability for the card to become other things if you, as the data subject, so desire. So again, more security features on the back and other bits of information. This is how the card looks. So as I mentioned, benefits to the user as a card holder. The card is free, is entitled, each citizen of the country is entitled to a free ID card. Residents are also entitled, if you're here for 6 months, you're also entitled to apply for a card. Protects and secures your identity with all the deep amount of security that the organization has. transparency in identity verification, one ID. So what will now happen, whereas before you had to go to institutions to get multiple IDs to, go get a JP sign this, get a letter from your bank, get something from JPS and carry all of these things, take weeks, one card, walk up, 1 minute, 5 minutes, you're getting the service and product that you need with a very highly secure system, right? Massively important. Simplification of bureaucracy, reduce the need for, as I mentioned in the example a while ago, verification from JP and all of those things. Reduce our jobs a little bit, that's good. Easy access to all the various benefits. So, where I live, I do have a few pensioners, and let me tell you, every quarter, whatever the time and period is, everyone comes, lines up, and I have to verify that, yes, I saw John Brown, I saw Mary Brown, I saw such and such, and they're all alive, right? So new systems will be put in place so that these things can happen much more easily, and it's in a more digital scenario where the person can just probably log in. I mean, those things are still being developed, and this infrastructure and ecosystem allows more people to be able to provide services to holders of these cards, so their services and products can be delivered quicker. So my system is telling me that I'm at 15 minutes prof core, so I will stop right here. I will also just say that the team looked at all the global best practices for IT security. National Institute of Standards and Technology, as a North American standard. HOBIT 5 was research detail. There are ISO 27001 systems and processes that are included, and other international security standards that have been implemented into the system for security. They left no stone unturned to ensure that we have the absolute best infrastructure to protect our citizens and the holders of the card's private data, right? The cybersecurity maturity certification model was used to vet the system at a very high level. And I am confident that what we have here can meet and probably exceed many of the international standards that are out there. Prof, over to you.
Thank you very much, Chris, Mr. Record. Very, very, very informative indeed. And in fact, I look forward to interrogating some of the points that you've made here, because I think for many of us, this might have been the first time we're seeing a sample and some of the list of benefits. And certainly it's reassuring to hear that many standards have been applied and let's say implemented. And therefore, we should hope that there is going to be openness in being able to answer questions that may ask about that implementation from you today, but I think in general going forward, that'd be good for public reassurance. So I look forward to the discussion. Thank you very, very much for that very rich presentation. We now move to our third speaker, Mrs. Georgia Gibson Henlin, who is King's Counsel at the Jamaican Bar and a certified information privacy professional and no stranger to these fora. Mrs. Gibson Henlin, are you ready to begin? We're seeing a presentation, but it's not yet in presentation mode.
I say good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon. Now we can hear you.
I think I was muted. I want to thank the UE for inviting me to do this interesting presentation on an area that I have not paid a lot of attention to until now. So the UE is really living up to its name of, causing people to, I suppose, learn new things, because I've not had the appetite for looking at NIDS prior to. And I did express to Dr. Busby Earl and Freddie when they spoke to me about NIDS, but I guess here we are. So if you were to ask me about NIDS, which is short for the National Identification Data System, I would want to, before getting into the law, express that when you access NIDS, or the objective of it seems to me, is that it is intended to foster digital equity. And what digital equity means is that everyone has access to, for example, government services, information, and opportunities. And in a sense, that's how law functions. Law functions in one way to make services available to the citizens of a particular country. And in that context, the law is expected to, observe the rights of persons. In this particular case, the subject matter, a lot of the law, even though it's about, because it's about identity, it is dealing with what we have come to know in the data protection space as personal data. It deals with issues relating to misuse or infractions. And of course, in order to ensure that people are not scared away or feel afraid of using such a system because of the misuse, there is recourse in the law to build trust. And as Dr. Busby Earl said when he started, that NIDS is not new, or I would say systems like NIDS is not new. In the US, now they are rolling out what is known as the Real ID. We know that Estonia, for example, has a digital society, and you heard him speak of the Aadhaar system or database in India, which has never been hacked. Now, the context in which these kinds of laws are now in Jamaica are able to sustain themselves is that I would say that it is architected for trust. And so you would see in NERA, built into NERA, there are requirements that ensure that the information that is in it is secure, protected, and in the event of loss, then there are rules. There are penalties, I'm sorry. What you will find, I would say, is that the information in a real sense is protected from all angles. You will recall, if you look at the history of NIDS, that one of the reasons it was struck down is that a protection that we are entitled to, for example, around our informational privacy was an issue. And with now the Data Protection Act being in place, we see that that gap was filled. Before that, there was a Cybercrimes Act, and within NERA itself, that is the act itself, the National Identification Registration Act, you will find as well that there are penalties. The information that is collected is identity information and biometric information. And Dr. Busby Earl went into great depth and he explained what that is from a technical perspective. But if you were to ask a layperson or a lawyer such as myself, or even if you look in the law, what you're seeing there, it's talking about the fact that it collects facial images, fingerprints, manual signature. And what is important about all of these things, you'll find, is that they are attributes, all attributes that we protect, that we own, and that we have dominion over. And you heard Chris talk about the fact that there'll be multi-factor authentication, where if you use your identity card, then something would come back to you for you to verify that it is you. And that's the manner in which based on the law, systems are put in place to ensure that your information remains protected. Now, I spoke about rights, and again, I have to emphasize that the law itself has given effect to our rights and dominion over our information. Again, against the context of what we call NIDS 1, where there was that challenge. And so you see that we have to consent and we are allowed to withdraw consent. So we don't have to register under NIDS if we don't want. In relation to minors, you will see that those under 18, parental consent is required. And if there are patients under the Mental Health Act, then the guardians are required. You know, the office of there's a registration authority, and you might have seen in the news around March of this year where the Prime Minister actually named a board, or in terms of establishing the authority. And what he indicated when he was, this is something I extracted from what he said, where he said this office is there to carry out a function of the state that continues regardless of who is the government or what the political policies are. And if I pause there, you'll recall I spoke about digital equality, and it is reflected in this statement. And it says further, this is about the establishment, the protection, and the utility of citizens' identity, citizens' records, and the civil registry within which these are entailed and protected. So here again, you're seeing that there has to be, and there is an acknowledgement that the information that is being placed in this system belongs to individual citizens or residents of Jamaica. Now, the system is actually broken out and identified in the law. So it says that when it comes into effect, it's going to have it's going to be a database of national identification numbers, and national identification cards. And you can see that it is automated and digitized because it talks about processes, automated retrieval and storage procedures, plans, networks, services, measures, interconnected and other associated elements for the enrollment of individuals, the verification of their identity, and the authentication of national identification numbers. So here you are seeing that it is the law is legislating what should happen in how the system works, and how and why the system is going to be a trusted system. That is why you see keywords here like verification of identity and authentication, which again harkens back to what Dr. Busby Earl spoke about when he spoke about the various systems by which you will be able to authenticate the identity of the various persons. As the earlier speaker indicated, when it spoke to the identification system versus the civil registry system. So we know now that the Registrar General's Department deals with births, deaths, marriages, adoptions, for example. And so that system, that entire system will be subsumed under the National Identification and Registration Database. And in terms of the identification data, you will see that it speaks to the enrollment for individuals, storage of identity information, the generation of and issue of national identification number and card to each individual, and the verification of the identification information of enrolled individuals, as well as authentication. Now, why would I read that off, given that it is already on the slide? I read it off because it's going to tie in with the statement that I made earlier about the fact that the law, given that we have dominion over information, given that it is our information, given that it is a constitutional right in terms of that particular information, you will see that these words, some of the words that are here, such as identity, verification, authentication, storage, and unique identification number, ring through not only NIDS, but other systems that have been set up, or other laws that have been set up to protect the information and to ensure that we trust it. And in that respect, we are talking about the Data Protection Act, and as well as the Cybercrimes Act. So I won't go into any detail on this, but the Act itself speaks to the technical security of identification information. I believe that Dr. Busby Earl dealt with that effectively. And from my angle, you will see that when you look through the law and all of these systems that are put in place that were described by Dr. Busby Earl and also by Chris, you will see that in the event that anyone attempts to what would call breach the system or have unauthorized access into the system, then there's a penalty from different aspects in terms of the offense that you commit. So you will see that you can be outside the system and have no access to be in the system. It's unauthorized access. You have access to the system, but you modified it without authority, there's a penalty. And then, of course, there's this penalty for unlawful interception of the information. So what you see, therefore, and I think it was Chris who went through this, where he spoke about the various systems, let us say the standards that he says that they are required to architect into the system using the NIST framework and the ISO 27001 framework on cybersecurity and privacy and IT and privacy of that information. So you can see that there is an effort in place to preserve the confidentiality of the information. One of the things that, because there's information sharing by the government, you will see where the public authorities are required. For example, public authorities like the Registrar General's Department, there's no civil penalty, as they say here, if in that kind of context, the information is shared. Now, so I spoke about the Cybercrimes Act, and I spoke about unauthorized access. So that's where, apart from NIDS, if there's unauthorized access to the system, there's a whole Cybercrimes Act, even prior to NIDS from 2015, which protects the infrastructure around which within which the information is kept. You will see that personal data in NIDS has the same meaning as in the JDPA without a change in definition. Information, however, stored relating to a living person or an individual who has been dead for over 30 years, where you can identify the person by that information sitting by itself or when aggregated with other information. And you see here as well that it talks about the expression of any opinion about the person. And it as well, quite apart from those who administer NIDS, you will see that because of this kind of definition as well, the authority would also be constrained when they are dealing with the information because they are public authority and the Data Protection Act also applies to the public authorities. You will see as well that it is the same confidentiality and security framework as in the Data Protection Act. You'll see that the Data Protection Act protects people's information, it confers rights upon them, and it confers obligations on those who have access or who have been given custody to that information. And you see that the penalties or the offenses in the Cybercrimes Act are the same as those that are in NIDS. So in effect, what I am really saying is that I believe that once properly administered, perhaps Jamaica may be able to boast, as does India, that there are sufficient safeguards in place, legal safeguards in place to protect the information that they have collected. That's it for me.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Gibson-Henlin. A number of points you've made about the legal support for the NIDS program and how it overlaps with some of the other related acts, including data protection and cybersecurity. There are some interesting questions that will arise because it also means that the flaws in those acts are also going to extend to this one. We'll come to that during the question and answer. But it is useful to know that that's how, from a legal standpoint, things have been set up. I think that's makes perfect sense to have coherence. We'll get more into it during the discussions. And now we can move to our fourth presenter, Miss Mikkel Jackson is an adjunct faculty member with the University of the Commonwealth Caribbean and Executive Director of Jamaicans for Justice. Her areas of expertise include social research, policy analysis, and development. And without further ado, I welcome Ms. Jackson to make her presentation.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much for having me. Unfortunately, when you're the last presenter, you will end up repeating a bit of what was discussed, but I will just ensure that I expound and may just bring a different perspective to some of the points as best as possible. All right, so let's get into it. And just to say that the topic that I will be focusing on is social inclusion and exclusion as well, and how we mitigate some of those provisions within the context of the national identification system. And at some points, I will be making reference to what was to what is, so that some of the fears that people may have can be allayed a little bit, and we are aware of how the NIDS and the current framework is actually providing greater protection for citizens. I think it's important, before I get into some of the benefits, that I quickly point out that the regulations governing the National Identification Registration Act and the system was tabled in Parliament a few weeks ago by the Senator, Dr. Dana Dixon. And since March of this year, we finally had the regulations governing the Data Protection Act being coming into effect. Why am I mentioning some of those areas? It's important for us to understand that the legislative framework and how these particular pieces of legislation provides protection for us has been strengthened, and it went through a process of engagement and participation from civil society organization, attorneys, data protection experts, and so on. So I think that type of assurance is important. Now, what are some of the benefits of NIDS? Earlier, you heard one of the speakers starting the process. And one of the things I have to reiterate is that sometimes, for example, you hear about Justice of the Peace saying to you that they are overwhelmed with some of the types of information and documents that they're asked to certify. You find that to open a bank account, for example, you have to be getting at least 2 pieces of information or documentation to actually get that process done. The other side of it is that I want us to understand that a number of the social services, for example, the PATH program and some of those other programs developed or delivered by the government of Jamaica, delivered through some of the agencies of the state, require that people have identity. We have to put in perspective, as I outlined that, and you hear, for example, agencies such as the Jamaica Social Investment Fund stating it, that when you look at certain marginalized population, not even a birth certificate is even within their possession. So even some of those basic civil registration and identity is not there. So the benefit of NIDS is that it would ensure that it reduces that type of bureaucracy to get access to bank accounts being opened, some of those other social services of the government. So I just want to put that in perspective for citizens. When we look at another benefit of NIDS, and I'm going to merge these 2 points, law enforcement and public safety. Very often we hear about people saying that their identity have been stolen. Not sure if we're aware that that is also a concern in Jamaica. For example, I think it was about 2 weeks ago, we got a complaint from a citizen to say that they went to the tax administration office to make some payment, and they were told already that there's another person with that identity that they have. So when you look at some of these issues in terms of identity theft, other areas of concern, trafficking, the national identification system based on best practice would be able to mitigate some of those things from happening. Why am I saying that? I think we have to be looking at what the NIDS would try to achieve. You're talking about a centralized location. You're talking about the type of protection that Mr. Reckford mentioned earlier, with even how the identity card itself is designed. So it reduces the possibility of someone stealing your identity. So those are important benefits. When we talk about social inclusion, very broad term, we're talking about ensuring that people who are more marginalized, those individuals who may have low literacy, persons who are living with disabilities, would be able to have their own NIDS card. And I will get into some of those areas specifically in terms of what JFJ sought to do when we made our recommendation to the Office of the Prime Minister when the regulations were being reviewed. For example, we said that if you are talking about people registering for a NIDS ID, how do we ensure that in practical terms we are bringing the enrollment process to individuals? So we came up with an idea, and we had a 30-second ad that would see the NIDS bus going in centralized location, working with the Jamaica Council of Persons with Disabilities, for example, working with the Jamaica Association of Deaf to ensure that persons with disabilities can have access. Because again, I'm not sure if we're aware, but some of the marginalized communities that I mentioned, low literacy, persons with disabilities, a large number of that population already do not have IDs, something as basic as that. So when you have NIDS rolling out and ensuring that you're going within communities and that their centers are centrally located, as well as having a mobile unit going out, the benefits of NIDS can be far realized to some of the more marginalized population that I mentioned earlier. Now, even though we're talking about benefits, it would be remiss of me not to give some caution to ensure that there is not social exclusion, and to ensure as a human rights organization that we aren't keeping abreast of what the possible areas of risk could be, and that we are holding the state accountable. And that I also explain that the regulations and the revised finally passed NERA Act would have ensured that some of these things were mitigated as best as possible. Now, surveillance and privacy rights concern, the previous speaker touched on that, and again, it's worth repeating. When you look at national identification systems globally, this is one of the areas that we have seen where there are privacy rights concerns. Am I sharing too much information? What will be done with my information when it is actually provided to NIDS? These are some of the areas. And let me explain how exactly the government has mitigated some of the concerns. Firstly, the first draft of NIDS, or should I say the first iteration of NIDS, which was for the most part struck down by the Constitutional Court, was asking for mandatory enrollment. That is no longer the case. Enrollment is optional for people. In other words, you have to give your consent. You can choose to enroll or not to enroll. There is no longer the concern that without NIDS, you won't have access to the state's benefit. Another key part of NIDS that I want people to understand, that you can say that I want to get out of NIDS at any time that I think it's no longer serving my purpose. So that option is also there. One of the things for NIDS that JFJ has also campaigned on and advocated for is the data minimization principle. What does that mean? It means that NIDS and any identification system should ensure that it is asking you for just the absolute information, the bare minimum that is needed to establish your ID. And you see, for example, if you look through the NERA Act, I believe it is section 11, it talks about the enrollment process and what establishes an ID. For example, your name, your address, and so on, and it uses the language of may. So in other words, several aspects of that would be optional. Not all of it would need to be provided. For example, your marital status and so on, because people had some concerns about that if I share the information of my spouse, which is very broad language, what is the implication? For example, people in same-sex relation, would I be unintentionally disclosing something that I don't think is necessary to establish an ID? The government now, through the NIDS regulation, further sought to allay any unnecessary information, mitigate any unnecessary information being shared. And what they did in the regulations, which JFJ made a submission around, is to say, let me know exactly through the application form what information is mandatory versus what information is optional for enrollment. So if you were to look at the application form that exists now, that has been tabled since in the regulations in the Senate, as I mentioned earlier, it had some asterisks beside it, which suggested that this is the bare minimum of information that needed to be shared. And JFJ said, very good job to the government, but just ensure that the regulations governing the NERA outlines and reflect what that application form is asking for. So for clarity, the absolute basic information that is needed to establish your ID, and that may include your full name, your date of birth, your sex, your nationality, facial imagery, and your manual signature. And in some instances, it may ask for your fingerprint, but again, that is just where applicable. All right. So that is something for us to concern ourselves about, how the information is going to be utilized, how is it going to be processed. And it goes back to the fact that NIDS is also in what you call now, it also has a good relationship with the Data Protection Act, which is why JFJ and others has said NIDS should not come into effect until the Data Protection Act would have seen its own regulations being passed, which we now have. The last thing I would mention on this slide is the matter of the third-party access that is mentioned in the Principal Act, and JFJ has said to the government when we made our recommendation around the regulation, ensure that the type of information, the who you call third party and accredited third party is properly spelled out in the regulations. And I heard where the senator said that several of our recommendations have been taken up. So some areas for improvement there. On this particular slide in my last 2 minutes, the question that many people may ask, what can be done to ensure that my rights are protected? And if I feel aggrieved, how can I get some protection or appeal process? In the NIDS Act, or the NERA, I should say, I believe it is section 26 thereabout, it spells out the appeal process. It tells you that you can let the appeal tribunal know what exactly your grounds for appeal is. Did you have a challenge with enrollment? Did you have a challenge where your information, the retention period was not being adhered to? Did you not get the notification when somebody requested your information? And the appeal process is spelled out in the NERA. And of course, you also have the Data Protection Act that also has their own appeal process there. If you believe that how the information within NIDS, how it is being governed, is not being adhered to within the principle of privacy rights and so on. So those are some of the processes you have to ensure that the appeal process is there and your rights are protected. All right. Thank you so much, and I'll answer any questions thereafter.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Jackson, for a very informative presentation on what NIDS. Very interestingly, because you're coming from JFG, you were fair enough to cover both the benefits of NIDS as well as some of the concerns that in fact you tabled and it seems have been addressed or are in process of being addressed. So we've now heard from our 4 speakers, and what I will do, we have a few questions from the public, but I'm going to table one first, just from and perhaps different panelists might have different perspectives on this. And actually, in a way, Ms. Jackson actually touched on this, and it has to do with the various principles in terms of how NIDS is interplaying with the Data Protection Act. So the Data Protection Act sets out various bases for collecting the information, and consent is one of those bases. What's the basis for NIDS? Is there an act that requires any of the information that they are collecting? In other words, the consequence for that would be what could be forgotten, and actually could leave it to the legal minds here perhaps to clarify what the consequence. So what is actually the basis, and what therefore are the consequences for when a user requests to be forgotten, and then perhaps from the NIDS side how that might be implemented. I don't know who wants to take it first.
So your first question is, what is the basis for collecting the data in NIDS?
Personal data, personal information, right?
Personal information in NIDS.
Right.
I would say, well, it's purely consent, but I think I would treat with NIDS as more like it's like a social engineering. It's a social engineering statute that is basically a part of or a pillar in the building of a digital society and building trust in that digital society. That's how I would look at NIDS. So that's why I say, and that's why they took out the compulsory component. And so when you look at it, they are selling you a value proposition, meaning if you want to be part of this digital society where things are easily accessible to you, hassle-free,
right,
then sign up to NIDS.
But does that actually mean that it is entirely by consent? So when somebody requests to be forgotten, all of their information is removed? Or is there a subset that's retained?
There's no right to be forgotten in NIDS. There's no right to be forgotten in the Data Protection Act. In the Data Protection Act, what is there is the right to demand accuracy or to ask the person to stop processing your information, which is quite different from saying, remove my information. That right to be forgotten is spoken about mostly in the context of the General Data Protection Regulation, which we all know as the Data Protection Act, but we do not have that in our law in that format. And I don't know if we're going there anytime soon.
Okay, so that's interesting. So it's a part of GDPR, which came from Europe, EU,
yes,
but we did not adopt it in our act.
Right, because we did not follow, which is another misconception perhaps. The Jamaican Data Protection Act is not based off the GDPR. It's based off the UK 1998 Data Protection Act.
Interesting. Okay, but it's still, there's a, Ms. Jackson, you want to come in on that?
I'm just saying that was one of the challenges we had, that it should have been based on several of those principles. And while the Data Protection Act is reflective of it, there are some challenges that we flagged with NERO. And the other thing that I wanted to add to this conversation is when you looked at the first iteration of how NIDS was structured, it basically went outside of the scope of establishing a national identification, because every piece of law that is passed, it would have in the wording of how the law is named, the purpose of it. And when you look at the current and past act governing NERO, it very simply says it is here to establish the National Identification Regulations Authority and the National Identification System. And therefore, the basis of it that will say what information is to be shared is to establish a national ID, which is why persons were saying, if it is to establish an ID, these are the types of information that one should provide in keeping with the data minimization principle.
And has that been, so that was your argument, was that respected? Is that currently reflected in the new implementation?
Yes, when you look at section 11 of the NERA, it spells out the type of information that may be shared for enrollment. And then when you look at the regulations now, it will tell you what information will be shared via the application form as well as the regulations itself. Remember when I was presenting, I said the application form, based on what we saw at the time, had the asterisk beside certain provision. And that is why JFJ had proposed to the government, and it seems as if they have accepted the proposal, but I haven't seen the last thing as yet, to say that if the application form has an asterisk beside these particular items, therefore the regulations should reflect what that application form is saying. The absolute information needed to establish an ID versus the optional information that one may need to give, for example, your fingerprint.
Right. Okay. Mr. Record, I hope you're available. I noticed that you've gone off screen. Are you able to say what exactly?
When I heard a lady quoting, I had to make sure that I go and collect my documents. So in case quoting has to go on, I can turn to the page, right?
Okay.
Went into my library.
I don't know if it's available to you at your fingertips, but would you be able to speak to what kind of information? So citizens don't have any right to be forgotten. We just heard that. But in the event that somebody wants to no longer be registered or no longer be participating in the NIDS program, how much information would be removed or deleted, if any?
Technically, I can't tell you the exact thing. I'd have to ask the actual team. However, when I did ask the question, when it came up a while ago, the team said to me, look, you can't erase that you existed. We can't say that Daniel Corey was never born and was never here in Jamaica.
Right.
That could lead to a tremendous amount of problems, including identification, theft, and things like that, right?
Right.
So what I think will happen is that you can say that you no longer want to be part of the NIDS system. So if you then say that your card will no longer work, in other words, the access to your piece of ID will just be disconnected. So if you say you don't want to be part of the system, you have to hand in back the card or destroy the card and provide some proof. I don't know if that entire system has been created as yet, but I do believe that is access to your piece of information that is there will go away. But
okay. And maybe this will be a transition into some of the security elements. In the event that someone chooses to how shall we say, stop the service, dissociate, and so therefore the service is stopped, the card no longer works. Is it that they have so they don't get any more services, but is it that none of the information that they provided would be, I don't know, removed from the database?
Right. So the team is telling me that your information, your email address, your physical address, your personal information that was used to register will all be deleted from the system.
Okay. So there is some of that. So for example, where somebody lives, if that got out and they were uncomfortable about that by removing themselves from the system, that would no longer be available through the system.
Correct.
All right. So now let me move on to another question. Actually, there is a question from the audience that had to do with the replacement costs on things like change of address, change of email, if that is collected there. I notice it's not on the card, but
sorry, Daniel. Just one thing on that last point. I think it should also be noted that once they implement blockchain, those transactions, in other words, deleting that information, the request to have that information deleted, those will still be retained because in the blockchain, it is immutable. And so there will be a chain of events or records that these things that once existed were requested to be removed and were removed by this person on this date.
That is
Right.
correct.
But well, okay, we'll come to the blockchain or what it will hold on it, but I presume that will be the transaction requesting the removal or the desist of service. That's not necessarily, doesn't mean that the information itself is available on the blockchain. I should hope.
Can I add something to that?
Sure.
Well, if we look at it from the data protection angle, remember that under that law, data shall only be retained for so long as you have a lawful right to be using it. So even though we do not have a right of deletion per se, the controller, which would be the authority, does not have a right of retention forever and ever. Amen. So at any point in time in the, I'll call it the data privacy life cycle, that they have their information, they'll have to account for it, and they'll have to account or give a basis for keeping it for a particular period. So it seems to me that if there's cancellation or withdrawal from the system, the data subject may very well have a right under the Data Protection Act to demand at some point that it should not be retained because the purpose for which I gave it to you no longer exists. I don't know how they'll put it into effect in practice, but I'm just saying that that's the right of the data subject and the obligation of the controller.
So that's a great point, because it does put some limitation on the time for which that be retained. It'd be interesting to see how that is actually implemented and how it plays out. I wanted to move to the well, there's two separate questions. One has to do with the security. We've heard, Chris, we've heard you mention that there's a lot of standards that have been adopted in implementation. But as we know, if you implement the standard improperly, you still don't necessarily get what you're supposed to get out of that standard. So one of the questions, that's not to say it's not been done properly. I don't mean to imply that at all. But one of the concerns that I have when we ask questions that have to do with, for example, architecture, not details. How, for example, is the data actually collected? Are you doing the encryption at the point of collection, or is it transmitted somewhere to be collected? What exactly is stored? Is that potentially, if that gets leaked, does that mean that individuals' biometric information is actually leaked? Or is it just some sort of key or associated information that is actually leaked? Elements like that are, I would believe, things that you would want to allow the public to interrogate, because those things provide more assurance. Can you speak to whether that is in fact what is contemplated, or if in fact there are better reasons that I am not able to see that those are being kept from the public? By the way, you're muted.
Yes, man. By design, protecting innocent people. The information, as I understand it, and I have not had my first cybersecurity meeting as yet, so I can tell you after that meeting. However, it is encrypted at collection, and it's actually requirement by the law. It's actually in the law. So one of the things that I would encourage folks, and I know it's not easy reading. I mean, it's not a tiny document, right? That especially technical folks like you would take a little peep to see, because a lot of those things are actually documented there. So yes, once collected, it's encrypted.
Right, but it's encrypted at source.
At source.
Not transmitted somewhere to be encrypted, for example.
That's what
you know what I mean. Yeah, right. And this particular forum is not necessarily the place to get into all of those details, but I think that the question really is more about whether informed individuals would have the opportunity to do that kind of interrogation of the system, not trying to get secrets, but to get sufficient detail that can sort of let informed citizens rest assured that, in fact, those standards to which you've harked and referenced, in fact, have been implemented properly. And in fact, so you provide more assurance that, yes, indeed, that not only are the systems implemented, but in fact have been implemented properly.
So good suggestion, and I will take it to the team that we probably have a more technical meeting and invite technical groups to come and have a discussion.
Fantastic,
yeah, great
fantastic, and of course this is UE, but this doesn't have to only be UE personnel. I think that it's in national interest. Okay. Yes. Yes.
Just for assurances again, that one of the reasons for us saying let's take a hold on NIDS until Data Protection Act came into effect is to ensure that even those who may be requesting information from NIDS, for example, law enforcement, that is, we have some challenges there. We won't get into that right now, but just to indicate that there is also that onus on data controllers under the Data Protection Act to ensure that a particular threshold in data management, how it is processed, is also done. So I just want to reiterate that particular point for the listeners. And I agree with you, and this is one of the things that JFG had asked for to be included in the regulations, that there is something that says that there is a responsibility of the authority to provide a quarterly or annual report. How is NIDS going? What were some of the challenges that we had? Who were some of these third parties who requested the information? How many people registered? And for transparency, if anything happened, you're very open about it. Don't wait until the media dig up something and then a big scandal occurs, because again, this is important. So just wanted to add that.
Right. Okay. Now thank you very much for that. And perhaps in a way, this is connected in terms of protections from a legal standpoint, because we heard from, in fact, both you, Mikhail, and I think Georgia also mentioned various protections in the law for potential breaches. But one of the concerns that we certainly have when it comes to how the law is set up is that there is definitely a penalty for those who commit the act, those who will sort of break into the system and disseminate information. And that, of course, applies to Jamaicans. But it seemed that there wasn't necessarily as much protection for those responsible for holding the data. Is there within NIRA any stronger requirement for, I mean, we've heard how it's being secured here, but, sort of connected to the point you're making, Mikhail, about reports, regular reports about how it's going and so on. Is there contemplated within the system a means to ensure that we have done our utmost so that foreign actors can't expose our information? Because we've done enough to try and dissuade or deter local actors. But the concern is potentially that you have foreign actors who expose our information to foreign people who then exploit the information. What kind of protections do we have against those? Obviously, the technical ones are part of it. Legally, do we have any?
They're in the Cybercrimes Act. Well, first of all, NIRA does speak to the appropriate technical measures and also that employees should be trained. However, bear in mind that the system is held within a computer, however large. That's what we're getting. And so they are required to, that's NIRA, the authority, to have in place systems that monitor for intrusion detection. And under the Cybercrimes Act, what you find is that bodies corporate that do not exercise due diligence in the implementation of systems, if there's in the event that there's a data breach, they could be held liable. And I say bodies corporate because I think when I was reading NIRA, I see that it is established, the authority is established as a body corporate, and under that law, those obligations are there. So I don't think That's why I did my presentation in the way that I have, by demonstrating that if you think about it from all angles, when you look at it, the system itself is architected for us to trust it because there's a legal framework around it, and also to constrain those who have been charged with the management of it.
Okay, thank you very much for that. That's actually reassuring.
Yeah.
Oh, and another point, somebody coming in?
Yeah, I add 2 points here. And I think we perhaps will be repeating this throughout, that we must also look at the broader context of privacy rights and how it's managed. Georgia mentioned the cybercrime, but I go back to the data protection. Remember now that the data protection was not just a legislation that came about because we want to enhance privacy rights. Let's be real here. The Data Protection Act was a component of our partnership with the European Union under the European Partnership Agreement to say that if we're doing e-commerce and so on together and information is going to be transferred, these are some of the minimum data protection and privacy data controlling mechanisms that must be there. So that burden of responsibility will also be there for people who will be receiving the information based on how the NERA and the DPA is also structured. One of the things I want to also go back to is the matter of the accredited third parties who will be receiving the information. One of the areas that JFJ had flagged, how do we establish a minimum criteria to say who's an accredited third party? I'm not sure exactly the regulations had then spelled that out, but that was an area that we had recommended that perhaps need to be spelled out, because there has to be some assurance that any information, even if it is limited to verifiable and authentication of the data, it must be with companies or whomever that has a particular standard that we can be assured that our data will be so protected. So just those two areas again to add to the conversation.
Thank you very much for that. Let me take a question. There's a question from the public that asked.
1 second, Prof.
Yes.
A quick answer to Michael's points a while ago. So the suggestions, I think, were taken in, and the organization does have several layers of approvals with respect to onboarding a third party. Just like any financial institution partnership, there has to be verification. There has to be, vetted. There's a vetting process that happens. So all of that is in fact in place. So it's not just the canary can send a document and email it in and you're good to go. No, it doesn't work like that.
Perfect. Thank you.
Are those individuals?
Pardon me?
Sorry, those third parties include like the courts example you're talking about, the
financial institutions that are part of the Jamaica Bankers Association and any other financial institution that plays in the ecosystem right now and would like to offer services to our citizens to make their life easier, just because you have this system in place.
Okay, so does that mean that in order for an organization to be able to use a NIDS in order to offer a service, they would first have to qualify to be a third party? What would you call it? I mean, they're already data controllers, but I'm not sure on the NIRA. What's the proper reference?
Right. So in the regulations, there is specific outlines, a set of specific. I'm actually trying to find the pages, but I should have had a digital copy.
I heard Mikkel trying to tell us, and I couldn't.
Right,
it didn't
here,
come through.
It's there, right? It's how third parties are governed. It's actually in the regulations.
Right. Okay.
Offering the language of accredited third party, based on the question. Yeah.
That's what I was trying to remember. Accredited third party. So that means that a company that wants to try to leverage the benefit of NIDS first has to get themselves registered as an accredited third party. Is that appropriate? Is that right?
Right. Okay. Accreditation agreement, authentication service, identification.
Okay.
All of this is part of the regulation.
All right. I have two connected questions. So one has to do, well, let me ask a public's question first. Does it apply to children? Will children be, not so much, let's not say required, but will children be permitted to obtain an ID? And if so, what age?
Yeah, I had mentioned that in my presentation that parental consent would be required.
Oh, okay.
Anyone under 18 or 18.
And it can be just like, is it like at the level of birth certificate? So as they're born, you go get a NIDS or you wait?
I think from your 6, I think that is it.
6, okay. Okay. I have a question following up. This is slightly different, but related to the kinds of services that will be offered and how this is managed. Since not all the information you're collecting at application is required, how will the services that might depend on optional information be managed or advertised? You know, how is that going to be, how is that imagined or implemented? If you understand what I'm saying. So something that might, I don't know, fingerprints are optional. If fingerprints were optional, something that demanded fingerprints and somebody chose not to give their fingerprints, how would that work?
Oh, I think you're referring to the I think Michaela's presentation where she had indicated that although they had this laundry list, which by the way, I don't agree, Michaela, that it's not too much. I think it's too much. They had this laundry list of things that you require.
Right.
If I work with Michaela's iteration or representation or interpretation of the section to say that there's a discretion as to what you collect, it seems to me that they would be collecting fingerprint because as from Curtis's presentation, if you are looking to deal with biometrics and to make it secure, then the biometric would be higher than I think I saw the password. Okay. And so on. So I don't think that would be an optional component.
No, okay, let's not get hung up on fingerprint. I was trying to use that as an example. I was simply saying, so maybe all the biometrics are being collected, facial, fingerprint, as well as signature. Actually, that was a question I had on your presentation, whether it was all or any. But let's just, what I was really questioning at this point was, for the optional information, if there are services that depend on those, how's that going to be managed?
Well, if I may, laundry list does suggest they're optional. So I go back to the regulation, which was my starting point, that the Principal Act suggests that these things are optional, but if this is just an ID being established, what are the very absolute
minimum
information that is needed? And that is what we had recommended for the government to clarify within the regulations itself, so that people are very clear that to establish an ID, all you need is the name, all the things that you would have, for example, on a driver's ID. But if you feel like you want to give the other information, like your biometrics, then the choice is yours. If the government, however, were to make changes to, for example, for you to get a PATH program benefit, you have this type of information. I may think that the government may come into some issues constitutionally at that point if it were to exit that route, because it would mean that it's a little bit of a flip around being done now when you look at the first iteration of NIDS. So I would hope that no government, current or future, would ever take that particular route, because it means that the reasons for NIDS being struck down in part before, where you say you must have these elements of an ID to get government resources. If it's not in NIDS, but no coming, for example, from the Ministry of Labor and Social Security, I would suspect that you may have some challenges there to answer the question.
Well, that would be interesting, certainly from a legal standpoint, how that might turn out. My question and thought was just simply from a commercial standpoint, a company that may want a particular level of verification, demanding that an individual who at the time of registration did not supply all of the information needed You know, how is it envisioned that those things would happen? I mean, here's a person showing up with their national ID, and then they're being denied because, you know, somehow it's somehow less than adequate. And yet, so that, you know, you could have this inconsistency where people believe if I have my ID, I can get this service, show up and then don't get it because, well, you didn't provide something that was considered optional. So,
Okay.
yes.
Right. I don't think it is as simple as just looking at the list and interpreting may to mean that it's this discretion that is unconstrained or unrestrained discretion. If we think
Okay.
about the ID, for example, when I referred to the version that they use in the United States and they say real ID,
Yeah.
they really mean an ID that is secure, one that is reliable, verifiable, has integrity, and can really be used to authenticate. And it seems to me that the essential components of whatever makes that ID a real ID, those, for example, the biometrics are not going to be optional. That's
Right.
how.
They'll be mandatory.
Correct.
Right. I appreciate what you're saying there. I was just simply interrogating around the concept of having optional information and how that might play out with services that might depend upon those optional pieces of information. But anyway, that's fine.
Is to include other information if it is needed, I think is the question you're asking.
No, it's okay. I don't need to belabor the question because I do want to get one more very important question in. And I think at the end of the day, there will be need for some kind of management. If in fact we do have optional information and somehow services that depend upon those. And you raised a very important point of let us hope that none of those services are essential services, because that would sort of flip around the very need for creating a data protection act in the first place when the first version of NIDS was struck out. But one point I wanted to touch upon
So just to
before we
answer a
left.
question that you raised a while ago, again, I'm gonna send you to the regulation, right? Send it to the act. The act in section 12 actually outlines specifically what is required in order for you to say that you now are part of the NID system and you now have a NIC. So if you take a look there, it outlines a list that I don't want to go through that right now. And then of course there's a
and all of those will be mandatory.
Correct.
Okay,
now,
right.
One important thing that the team, when we had our meeting recently, they outlined, not everyone in Jamaica has a fingerprint. Right? So which is why, remember, there are two bits of biometrics that are there. Fingerprint, right? To ensure that there's things. So there are some folks that don't have fingerprints. And of course, children below a certain age, the fingerprint is not yet fully developed. That is why fingerprints only come into play after a certain age. And I think I did mention 6. So those are the things that are there. Okay.
I see. Okay, no, thank you very much for that. That helps. All right, there's one more item I wanted to move to before we had to close for the evening, and that had just to touch upon the blockchain element, because that was mentioned as one of the features that was going to keep the blockchain not so much about security as much as it is about transparency and sort of making sure there's an immutable element to this. Is the blockchain that's going to support NIDS going to be publicly accessible? Is it wide open? Anybody can look at it at any time?
I have to ask the security team that. I don't know.
Okay. Okay. All right. So let me put it to fine. Fair enough. I don't know. Curtis, do you want to comment on what would be the recommended implementation and for support and supporting infrastructure for that blockchain?
Thanks, Daniel. Well, yes, I would like to think that some degree of transparency, because the idea thing behind the use of blockchain is to provide an audit trail. I would be highly doubtful that any of the actual data would be stored on that blockchain. And so I would also think that a part of the registration process, again, as I've heard the discussion that's been ongoing, there may be some optional components. Well, an optional component could be a registered public key pair that a person can have. And if that blockchain system is made available, let's say to those who are registered on the system and who have opted to also get such a public key pair, then that could be used for argument's sake as the sort of public way of providing access to an individual to see the contents of that blockchain. So I think that would be a way of providing it, but also still limiting the access so that not, again, it may be a feature or a little perk of registering with the NIDS.
Okay. And I guess the final part of this is the implementation of a blockchain. The reason that it's considered immutable and safe and all of that is fundamentally that you want the nodes to be distributed, to not be controlled by a single authority, to not have a single point of failure. Those are the features that give it that reliability.
Yes, and
how will that be? How's that contemplated? Is that known in NIDS?
Well, I don't know. You see, that's the thing, right? What I would love to get from NIDS. Now, I understand and agree that to a point, some information should not be divulged. But other systems of national identifications make public, for example, the underlying mechanism, the underlying protocol, right? So are we using ECC? If we're using ECC, what's the key size?
And ECC stands for those of you
Sorry,
who don't.
elliptic curve cryptography, which is
Right.
like
Which is a stronger version, right?
But uses smaller key sizes. But what is the key size, right? Those kinds of things then would give certainly members of the public who are aware of these things some sort of assurance that, well, this is actually strong. It now just depends on how it's implemented. And now with the hashes of the nodes on the blockchain, the information of one node also incorporates information from a previous node. And those are also distributed across many different locations.
You mean the blocks in the blockchain?
Sorry, yeah.
Because the nodes will be the computers only. But yes.
It's essentially a link, you know?
Yes, that's right.
Blocks. And so there was also some, I had mentioned how aware with this information, where would it reside? Is it going to be on one central server? Is it going to be distributed? Where are those servers going to reside? Because again, certainly in Jamaica and wider Caribbean, the servers and the infrastructure could, based on reports, be secured. The security could be improved. And so that then introduces a bit of concern as to where and so on this information will be stored.
True. But if it's public information, maybe it's not. The point is it's not sensitive. You want redundancy, as much redundancy as possible. Let me allow, okay, I do see George's hand, but let me allow Chris, if he wishes or can, to respond to any of that if he has any such information. If not, then I'll just go straight to George.
So I reached out to the team, and one thing that we're going to do is, based upon all the questions that we have here today, I'm going to suggest that we put together a short paper that explains all of this and submit it back to the university. And we may be able to just have a special discussion and meeting around this.
Fantastic. Fantastic.
I made that
we look forward to it.
That would be wonderful.
Questions from here. I'll put all the questions from the recording here and put it in front of the committee when we meet.
Oh, wonderful. Wonderful. Georgia?
Right. I don't want to belabor the point about the optional component, but I think it's important to understand that I think that what's built into the law is this whole question of identity. So who are you? So there's going to be that information. Then there's going to be that verification information that you can provide, and they give you different pieces of IDs, as Chris was pointing out in section 12. It's not all of them. It depends. That can be used to verify that you are who you said, you told me that you were. And then authentication is that technical level No, of ensuring that the person identified is the same person that's logging into the system. So I think that when we talk about the optional components, it is really saying what information can you give me of all of these? So I think maybe it's more like a suite of information that can be used for one of those three components. So they wouldn't need all of them. So it's from that angle that you can look at the optional.
One of those three components, sorry, which three components?
Identity, verification, authentication.
Okay.
So they'll give you a multiple choice, for want of a better term, of picking the information probably that can identify, picking what can verify, and what can authenticate. And it goes back to the point, what about the network?
At the time of registration, you'd still have had to collect all of those.
Probably not. That's what I'm saying. Because if I have a passport that can verify my information, or as they say here, a decree absolute that can verify my information, then they may not need to collect from me the national, that voter's ID card, as an example, if I use those. So if I had the passport, they would not necessarily ask me for the voter registration. Some people have voter registration, as you may know, but not passport.
Yeah, all right, it's okay.
Ask for both in terms of verification. That's all I'm trying to say.
Okay, that's fine. I misunderstood what you're saying, so my comment, you can ignore it. I was referring to the registration process. You'd have had to supply all of the information that's being used for verification and or authentication.
Correct, correct.
Right.
Yeah, you're on the same page.
Yes. We actually are technically out of time, but I do not want to leave out one question that I missed that came from the audience, and that maybe can be answered quickly. I don't know who's best placed to answer it. It had to do with, can data be used for census, given that many people have been missed over the last few census periods? I don't know who wants to take that.
All right, so I don't want to technically give you the final answer. However, we need to realize that this system is built for national identification. And I think Georgia also just kind of emphasized that that's what the system is for. If you talk about census, and you can start to jump in and talk about a whole pile of other things, the system was not built for. So let me just leave the answer at that.
So maybe, but that's not what it was designed for. Okay.
It was not designed for that.
Okay. Are there any legal prohibitions or prescriptions against that?
Purpose limitation in terms
Purpose limitation.
The Data Protection Act would constrain you right there.
Okay, very good answer. Thank you very much. Okay, on that note, we are actually out of time, but if there's any burning issue that any of the panelists would like to say briefly, that they feel hasn't been covered at all, I'd give you an opportunity to do that now. And maybe I'll just give you in order. Let me just go in speaker order. So I don't know, Curtis, do you have anything that you'd like to add, say, before we close?
Just to add to the conversation that I'm looking forward to with Chris and his team. We also didn't get a chance to talk about digital signatures and whether or not those would be incorporated in the entire system, because that also would be something that would be, I think, very beneficial to the citizens. So again, if that's a consideration, maybe it's not in this phase, is it at all a consideration at some point in time? And how would that also be implemented? How is it envisioned?
Right. Okay. Thank you very much. Chris, any closing remarks?
No burning closing remarks, but just a few little bits of correction. I think when in Georgia's section, I think she had a interesting explanation of what the acronym NIDS meant. I just want to make a quick correction there. I think she said something around, or not said, I think she has it on her slide that says something on National Identification Data System. No, that's not what NIDS means, right? It's National ID System, and ID is just for identity, right? So it's a National Identification System. So that's one quick correction. Another quick correction was...
That was also in our title, so we also stand corrected.
Exactly, so he's not correcting me. He was just looking at the title that I wrote.
Correct.
All right, okay.
Right, so
yes, go ahead, Chris.
So yes, that's a correction there. That NIDS actually means the National Identification
ID System.
And then there's another quick correction. It was mentioned maybe once or twice. I'm not calling any names because I really don't remember who mentioned it. But I just want to rest assured that the Registrar General's Department is still the Registrar General's Department. It's not being subsumed or consumed or anything like that. It's an organization, and yes, the new authority will let's say manage it or have some administrative oversight, but the organization will remain the organization. It's not being, you know.
So it's not that RGD is going away.
No,
really?
RGD is not going away. No.
Right.
As you mentioned that they have their own database, which is their own database, and it's separate and it's not connected. So I was told by my technical superiors to mention that the two databases are separate and not connected. So those are the things I just want to mention.
Okay, so if you don't want to be part of NIDS and you want the birth certificate, don't be afraid that somehow it's going to leak into NIDS or anything like that.
You're correct. Exactly. So I'm also asking Dr. Busby Earl if all the burning questions that he has around security, please, he could ask Freddie to send them or he can send them on, and I will ensure that at our next monthly meeting, I bring it up and I make the proposal to answer them in a very short, shareable document that we can have another one. That's a private forum to just discuss the security. So
very much appreciated.
Fantastic. We're looking forward to that.
Folks. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chris. Georgia, any final words from you?
Yeah, I think that there is a definition in the Act that speaks to what the system actually is, and perhaps that is where you got the National Identification Data System from. It talks about what the National Identification System is, and then it identifies the two databases or two main databases that are there. So just for further clarification.
Okay. Any issues that you felt we didn't touch upon or that you want to emphasize before we close?
There was one, but then I have a senior moment. So
all right.
Let me jump in with one, because in the instructions that were sent to me, there was a concern about accessibility. I think it was in inclusion. I thought Michael might have jumped into a little bit of it, but I just want to say that the organization will have 24 service centers all around Jamaica. And I think in Michael's presentation, there was a mention of a mobile service center. And yes, that actually will happen. And so the service centers will provide for folks with disabilities. And so full 100% inclusion is expected. The NIC card is accessible to every individual from birth for free. So no funny dirty thing going on about anybody charging for no.
And the replacements are for free? That was a question that the public had.
Replacements are not free.
Okay.
So
when you change your address, you'll need to pay for the new card.
I don't think it's a change of address, because I don't think change of address requires you to change. When you lose it.
Okay.
If you lost it or you got damage or something, but I can clarify all of that when we have our clarification.
All right, we really need to close. So, Mikhail, your final words?
Just to say, I'm happy just listening into Mr. Rickford in particular, where some of the concerns that we had made around the regulations have seemingly been adopted. And that's good for any human rights organization. And to indicate to the public to just be aware of what the provisions are around enrollment. And if you want to deregister, for lack of a better terminology, so that we're not listening to information online that is not so. I think that type of clarity is very, very important. And if there are challenges, to just document them and share them. So when the NERA is being reviewed, then at least we can have these proper documentation to, of course, make the principal act governing the NIDS be a better version of it. So that is my final say.
Thank you very much.
Those were the 10 slides that I removed, Prof. Daniel Core, that explains registration and how you take yourself off. But I had to take off to give you back.
And that would have taken more time than you had. So we understand. Not everything that you said is a limit. So there is more to NIDS than what you had time to report on. Yes, we fully understand that. I want to, at this point, bring our session to a close, I want to thank very deeply the ladies and gentlemen of our panel this evening who provided a rich, not just presentations, but in fact, rich discussions afterwards. I do hope that all of you who have been attending feel at least a little bit more enlightened at this point about what NIDS is, what its benefits plan are, some assurance about its security, hopefully that you may have had before, and maybe even some assurance from the promises that we've heard today about allowing more deeply technical scrutiny of some of those, at least the architecture. With that, thank you very much for your engagement. We also got engagement from the online community. Thanks very much to the faculty team that provides the support to allow these events to occur. Thank you all and have a good evening.